Hello everyone and welcome to my channel Y&R Trends. I hope everyone is having a wonderful day. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. Jill Abbott had lived utmost of her life believing she had formerly seen every possible treason, every ruinous secret that the Abbott and Newman families could throw at her. Genoa City had hardened her in ways many could understand. Yet as she stood alone in her hostel suite, the megacity lights blinking through the window like silent substantiations, Jill knew this disclosure would change everything. The envelope in her hands felt heavier than it should have, as if the verity inside carried physical weight. She had gone back and forth for days, scuffling with whether this secret justified daylight or burial. But the history had a way of clawing its way to the face, and Jill was no foreigner to that verity. The DNA report verified what her instincts had been brooding for times. Cain Ashby was who the world believed him to be. Not completely. Not entirely. His birth traced back not only to the Ashbys, but unmistakably to the Abbotts. Jack Abbott's son. A secret child conceived in a time of chaos, deception, and emotional recklessness that indeed Jill had tried to forget. Seeing Jack's name published so clinically on the report made her stomach strain. This wasn't gossip or dubitation. Presently, this was wisdom. This was inarguable, and formerly unleashed, it would crumb through Genoa City with unrecoverable force. Jack Abbott, for all his confidence and charm, had erected his life around the idea of heritage. Jabot, his children, the Abbott name itself were extensions of his identity. Jill knew how deeply Jack valued family, indeed when fractured. That was precisely why this secret scarified her. Cain wasn't some distant mistake that could be smoothed over with plutocrat or justifications. Cain was a living, breathing man with his own scars, his own intentions, and his own complicated relationship with the people of Genoa City. To reveal that he was Jack's son meant rewriting decades of history. Meanwhile, Cain Ashby had been scuffling with his own sense of relegation. For times he'd felt like a stranger, no way completely belonging anywhere. His marriage failures, his professional lapses, his constant hall of war between morality and ambition all sounded to point to a man searching for his place in the world. He'd criticized himself for that restlessness, believing it was the result of his own poor choices. What he didn't know was that the answer had been written in his DNA each on. He wasn't running from his failures. He was running toward a verity he didn't yet understand. Victor Newman tasted the shift before anyone differently did. He always did. Power had stoned his instincts, and when whispers reached him about Jill's unforeseen secretiveness and Jack's symptomatic distraction, Victor paid attention. The idea that commodity could live beyond his control bothered him deeply. Victor flattered himself on knowing everything about his adversaries and abettors likewise. Secrets were currency in his world, and someone was hoarding precious information. That alone made him dangerous. When Jill eventually requested a meeting with Victor, she did so knowing she was walking into the captain's den. The Newman estate had always represented dominance, and Victor's presence only amplified that energy. Jill didn't come unrehearsed. She knew Victor would try to twist the verity into an armament, and she was determined to control the narrative before he could. What she didn't anticipate was how tête-à-tête Victor would take the disclosure. Victor had spent times manipulating Cain, alternatively using him as a pawn and dismissing him as expendable. Learning that Cain carried Abbott blood reframed everything. This wasn't just about Jack presently. This was about heritage contest on an inheritable position. The Abbotts and Newmans had battled for decades, but now that contest was etched into Cain's veritably actuality. Victor realized incontinently that Cain represented a ground and a threat. However, it could strengthen the Abbott conglomerate in ways Victor hadn't provisioned. If Cain aligned himself with Jack, however, the fallout could be just as destructive if Cain rejected Jack. Jill's concession landed like a lemon. Victor masked his response, but outside, fury and seductiveness warred for dominance. He demanded evidence, and Jill slid the DNA report across the table without vacillation. She had prepared herself for Victor's wrathfulness, but what unsettled her was his silence. Victor read the report sluggishly, methodically, as though savoring each word. When he eventually looked up, his expression was undecipherable. That silence told Jill everything she demanded to know. Victor was formally calculating his coming move. Jack Abbott was the last to know, and that detention visited Jill. She had wanted to cover him, but protection had morphed into deception. When Jack eventually brazened her, the pain in his eyes cut deeper than any blameworthiness. Jack wasn't angry at first. He was stupefied. The idea that he'd a son he no way knew about challenged his tone image in ways he wasn't prepared for. He replayed old recollections, old connections, moments he'd dismissed as insignificant. Suddenly they carried new meaning. Jill watched as Jack's shock turned into guilt, also craving. The desire to know Kane, to make effects right, burned visibly beneath his controlled surface. Kane still didn't admit the news with the same quiet reflection. When Victor assured the verity reached him in the most brutal way possible, Kane's world shattered. His entire identity felt compromised. The man he allowed. He was the family he believed he belonged to. All of it felt like a taradiddle. Kane questioned every choice he'd ever made. Had he been unconsciously drawn to the Abbotts all along? Had his contest with Jack been fueled by commodity deeper than business and pride? The disclosure touched off a storm of emotion across Genoa City. Lily plotted to understand what this meant for her family. The idea that Kane's roots lay with Jack Abbott restarted injuries she had healed. She bothered about how this verity would affect their children, their future, and Kane's formerly fragile sense of tone. Phyllis, no way one to miss an occasion, saw the chaos as both a trouble and an advantage. She understood how destabilizing this secret could be and incontinently began situating herself to profit from the fallout. Victor, meanwhile, wasted no time exploiting the situation. He subtly pushed Kane toward resentment, feeding his wrathfulness and framing Jack's ignorance as abandonment. Victor understood pain and he knew how to weaponize it. He suggested that Jack's failure to admit Kane before wasn't accidental, but accessible. That suggestion rotted in Kane's mind, heightening the pique between father and son before they ever had a chance to connect. Jack tried to reach out, but his sweats were clumsy, burdened by guilt and query. He wanted to explain, to apologize, to make commodity meaningful, but he undervalued the depth of Kane's hurt. Kane didn't want explanations. He wanted responsibility. Times of feeling overlooked and underrated now had a face, and that face was Jack Abbott's. Their first hassle was tense, charged with implied resentment and unmet prospects. Neither man knew how to bridge the gap between blood and treason. Jill watched the fallout with an admixture of remorse and resoluteness. She knew revealing the verity had been the right thing to do, but that didn't vindicate her of responsibility. She had played a part in shaping this tragedy, whether designedly or not. Jill tried to intervene, to soften the edges of the conflict, but she snappily realized that some injuries needed time, not intervention. The verity had been unleashed, and it would follow its own path. As the weeks passed, alliances shifted. Kane began to question Victor's motives, fading the familiar pattern of manipulation. At the same time, Jack's continuity sluggishly minced down at Kane's defenses. Small moments of recognition, participated erraticisms, and unanticipated parallels created cracks in Kane's resistance. He couldn't deny the pull he felt toward Jack, indeed as he begrudged him for it. Victor's plan began to unravel when he realized he'd undervalued the power of blood ties. Kane wasn't a pawn. He was a man reconsidering himself, and that made him changeable. The possibility that Kane might one day stand beside Jack rather than against him unsettled Victor further than he watched to admit. The Abbott heritage, formerly allowed, secure and limited, now expanded in ways that hovered Newman dominance. The disclosure of Kane's true lineage reshaped Genoa City's geography. It wasn't just a secret uncovered. It was a reckoning. Families were forced to defy uncomfortable trueness, commitment were tested, and the vision of control shattered. Jack faced the challenge of being a father to a son who didn't trust him. Kane faced the task of coordinating his history with his future. Jill carried the burden of knowing she had set all of this in stir. In the end, the DNA didn't just reveal a natural connection. It exposed the fragile foundations upon which power, identity, and family were erected. Genoa City would no way be the same. And as Victor Newman watched the Abbotts acclimatize and evolve, he understood one inarguable verity. This secret didn't just change Kane's life. Changed the game ever. The disclosure didn't settle into Genoa City still. It dallied in boardrooms, echoed through extensions, and strained into private moments when characters believed they were alone with their studies. The DNA verity came further than a secret exposed. It converted into a living presence that followed Jack, Cain, Victor, and Jill far and wide they went. Every regard felt loaded. Every silence felt purposeful. Genoa City had always thrived on secrets, but this one carried generational weight. Jack Abbott set up himself reconsidering corridor of his life. He'd long buried beneath success and reinvention. He'd always considered himself a man who learned from his miscalculations, someone who faced consequences head-on. Yet the actuality of Cain challenged that tone perception. Jack wasn't visited by the act that led to Cain's generality as much as he was visited by the absence. He'd miss birthdays, dolor, palms, and failures. He'd intentionally allowed his son to struggle alone in a megacity that awarded strength and penalized vulnerability. That consummation cut deeper than any commercial loss. At Jabot, Jack's distraction came conspicuous. Opinions that formerly came painlessly now needed deliberation. The board tasted weakness, and whispers spread about insecurity at the top. "I'll notice first." He'd seen his father shaken ahead, but no way like this. There was commodity heavier behind Jack's eyes, commodity undetermined. Kyle's own relationship with Jack complicated his response. The idea that Cain was his half-family unsettled him, not because of covetousness, but because it forced him to defy the fragility of family identity. Pedigrees, formerly assumed inflexible, were suddenly fluid. Cain, meanwhile, began to unravel his history with ruthless honesty. He examined every contest, every failure, every instinct that had driven him toward conflict with Jack Abbott. What once felt like coexistence now felt ineluctable. There was wrathfulness, yes, but also grief. Grief for the life he might have had if the verity had surfaced before. Grief for the guidance he no way entered. Cain questioned whether he'd have made different choices had he known who he truly was. That question tortured him, offering no answers and no relief. Lily watched Cain change in ways that frightened her. He grew quieter, more introspective, yet his silences carried an edge. She honored the signs of a man standing at a crossroads, doubtful which direction would define him. Lily stressed losing him not to Jack or Victor, but to the weight of his own undetermined identity. She tried to base him, reminding him of the family he'd erected, but indeed she couldn't contend with the pull of a verity that readdressed his actuality. Victor Newman observed all of this with calculated restraint. Intimately, he appeared indifferent, indeed dismissive. Intimately, he was furious. He'd undervalued Jill, undervalued Jack, and undervalued the power of verity. Victor despised variables he couldn't control, and Cain had come exactly that. Worse, Cain had implicit. Abbott blood combined with Ashby cunning created a man who could disrupt the balance of power Victor had spent decades maintaining. Victor's instincts told him to neutralize the trouble. He explored options still, probing Cain's vulnerabilities, offering openings laced with retired strings. He deposited himself as a tutor, someone who understood treason and reinvention. Victor framed Jack's ignorance as neglect, painting himself as the only one honest enough to admit Cain's pain. It was a familiar strategy, one Victor had perfected over times of manipulation. But this time, commodity didn't land the way he anticipated. Cain began to fate the pattern. He'd been on the entering end of Victor's tactics before, but now the stakes felt particular in a way they no way had. Cain realized that Victor wasn't interested in his well-being. He was interested in influence. That consummation sparked commodity dangerous in Cain, not just wrathfulness but clarity. For the first time, Cain understood that his power lay not in choosing sides, but in refusing to be possessed by either. Jill Abbott, watching events unfold, scuffled with her own demons. She had always been proud of her adaptability, her capability to survive and acclimatize. Yet the fallout from her disclosure tested that pride. People looked at her else now, some with admiration, others with blameworthiness. Jill knew she had done the right thing, but right didn't always mean effortless. She set up herself insulated, indeed from those who had formerly trusted her implicitly. Jill redefined her recollections with brutal honesty. She conceded her fear, her denial, and her pretenses. She had induced herself she was guarding everyone by staying silent, but now she questioned whether that silence had been further about tone preservation than altruism. Jill understood commodity utmost people didn't verity delay didn't soften impact. It amplified it. She resolved not to retreat. Indeed, as the consequences continued to ripple outward, the disclosure began to alter commercial alliances. Investors suspected about Kane's part in Jabot's future. Would Jack bring him into the fold? Would Kane reject the Abbott heritage entirely? The query unsettled the request, and Victor exploited that insecurity, still obliging board members and challengers likewise. He sought to turn nebulosity into advantage, but the unpredictability of Kane's choices complicated his sweats. Jack, driven by a blend of guilt and determination, tried a different approach. Rather of pushing for conciliation, he concentrated on responsibility. He conceded his failure without reason, fating that intentions didn't abolish consequences. This shift didn't go unnoticed. Kane, though resistant, began to see Jack not as an idealized father figure or a villain, but as a defective man defying his own failings. That nuance signified. Their relations remained tense, but they came less hostile. Silence replaced battle. Shared space replaced avoidance. These subtle changes pronounced progress, indeed if neither man was ready to name it. Kane plotted with the fear that accepting Jack would mean erasing the life he'd erected singly. Jack plotted with the fear that pushing too hard would drive Kane down permanently. Both men walked a tightrope of anticipation and restraint. Victor tasted instigation shifting and grew more aggressive. He blurted picky information, fueling rumors designed to provoke public response. He framed the Abbott disclosure as substantiation of moral decay, suggesting insecurity within Jack's leadership. Victor's ideal was simple: force Kane to choose sides under pressure. He believed that in chaos people revealed their true commitment. The strategy boomeranged. Rather of pushing Kane toward Victor, it pushed him toward autonomy. Kane begrudged being treated like a prize in a war he hadn't started. He began to assert boundaries, refusing to engage in Victor's games. That resistance frustrated Victor further than outright opposition ever could. It gestured a loss of influence commodity Victor infrequently permitted. As Kane asserted himself, Lily set up renewed stopgap. She saw casts of the man she loved arising from beneath the weight of disclosure. She supported his independence, indeed when it meant distancing himself from important abettors. Lily understood that Kane demanded to define himself on his own terms, not as Jack's son or Victor's asset. Their relationship, though strained, grew stronger through participated honesty. Meanwhile, Kyle and Summer grappled with the counter-accusations of expanded family ties. The idea of Kane as part of the Abbott lineage challenged their hypotheticals about belonging and annuity. It forced exchanges about honor, heritage, and responsibility. These conversations, though uncomfortable, revealed cracks in long-held beliefs about what it meant to be an Abbott. Heritage, they realized, wasn't just about blood. It was about choice. Phyllis watched from the sidelines, assaying every shift with sharp suspicion. She honored occasion in chaos but also peril. Kane's independence made him changeable, and unpredictability was commodity Phyllis both respected and stressed. She batted whether aligning with Kane could strengthen her position or expose her to new pitfalls. In Genoa City, alliances were currency, and Phyllis was no way short on ambition. Jack ultimately made a decisive move. He intimately conceded Kane as his son, not with fanfare but with sincerity. The advertisement wasn't about legality or power. It was about responsibility. Jack understood the threat, but he accepted it willingly. He refused to let fear mandate his conduct any longer. This acknowledgement didn't abolish Kane's pain, but it validated his actuality in a way nothing differently could. The megacity replied incontinently. Media enterprise exploded. Stock prices changed. Exchanges boosted. Victor watched the advertisement with slightly concealed fury. Jack had taken control of the narrative, denying Victor the chance to weaponize the verity further. It was a strategic move wrapped in emotional honesty, and Victor honored it as similar. Kane's response surprised everyone. He didn't incontinently accept Jack's gesture, nor did he reject it. Rather, he chose distance. He made it clear that acknowledgement didn't equate to conciliation. He demanded time. He demanded space. That decision, though frustrating to Jack, demonstrated maturity and tone mindfulness. Kane was no longer replying. He was deciding. As weeks passed, the intensity of the original fallout gave way to deeper, more complex consequences. Connections recalibrated. Power structures acclimated. The disclosure came lower about shock and further about metamorphosis. Genoa City acclimated as it always did, but not without scars. Victor, facing resistance on multiple fronts, reconsidered his approach. He realized that brute force would no longer suffice, however. He'd need to be admired or removed from the equation entirely, if Cain couldn't be controlled. Victor began exploring long-term strategies, bones, that needed tolerance rather than dominance. It was a rare concession, indeed, if he no way admitted it audibly. Jill set up a measure of peace in the fate. The Verity, formerly released, no longer counted on her heart. She remained watchful, apprehensive that her part in the drama was over. Jill understood that families didn't heal overnight. Secrets didn't dissolve just because they were exposed. Healing needed continuity, modesty, and time. She committed herself to supporting that process, indeed when it meant standing alone. The Abbott family faced a reckoning. They were forced to defy uncomfortable trueness about annuity, identity, and remission. Jack, though burdened by remorse, surfaced more predicated. He accepted that being a father wasn't about perfection, but presence. Cain, though wounded, began to fantasize a unborn footloose by resentment. The possibility of conciliation dallied, fragile but real. Victor Newman, for all his power, set up himself on strange ground. He'd lost control of the narrative, and worse, he'd burned a metamorphosis he couldn't reverse. The disclosure he formerly viewed as an armament had come a catalyst for growth. That consummation unsettled him deeply. In the end, the DNA disclosure did further than expose a secret son. It disassembled visions of certainty and forced every character involved to review themselves. Genoa City survived the shock, but it didn't crop unchanged. Power shifted. Commitment evolved. And the heritage of the Abbott name expanded beyond what anyone had imagined. The Verity had spoken, and its echoes would shape the future for generations to come.